John 13 is where I'd love to take your attention this morning. John 13, as we discuss this section of Scripture that is almost everybody is probably remotely familiar with. If you're not familiar with what we're looking at in John 13, I know you've probably at least heard of the story. This is where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. We'll talk about that more here in just a second. But I appreciate everybody being here. We do have visitors among us, and so we're thankful that you've chosen to be with us. We have a lot of our people, as is common in the summertime, that are gone. We have a lot of people that are in. We also have people that are here that did the invitation on Wednesday night. I meant to talk to Casey about it on Wednesday night, but he gave the invitation on Wednesday night during our worship service, and I thought he did a phenomenal job. He did a great job with that. I appreciate the things he had to say, and we'll look forward to more men doing that in the future. I think that's the plan moving forward, and so it's good to hear other people and good to hear what they have to say, especially someone who does a story on Jonah. I always appreciate the story of Jonah because I feel like I am Jonah 9 times out of 10. And so I appreciate him doing that story and also talking about some things I hadn't really thought about before. John 13, if you're familiar with this story, you probably know exactly what it's about. This is a story where Jesus is up in the Last Supper. This is where the room has been prepared. And for 4 chapters, Jesus is going to dispense with his apostles with all the different things that he wants them to know moving forward. And a lot of it is encouragement things. If you read a lot of what he says, especially in chapter 14, 15, 16, is very encouragement heavy. He wants to remember that the Holy Spirit is going to come. He wants them to know that he's going to prepare a place for them. All those things are involved in that. But John 13, I think you can rightfully argue, is the engine that drives the entire narrative, because rather than give this long exposition about what it means to actually be a servant, he gets down and demonstrates it. This is the famous scene where Jesus takes a towel, he puts it over his arm, he gets down and he washes all 12 of the apostles' feet, up to and including, and this is a subtext on it, up to and including the feet of Judas. And this is designed to be this incredible scene where Jesus is talking to the apostles and he says, this is what I've done to you, and if I am your master, then this is something you should also do to each other. Peter kind of kicks back at it at one point. Peter says, well, this isn't something you should be doing to me. You're far greater than I am. I should be washing your feet. And Jesus reaffirms that this whole point of this is to demonstrate that true leadership serves. And you think that this exists in a vacuum, but actually if you look back in Luke chapter 22, I know I said John 13. If you go back to Luke chapter 22, this is more or less the fulfillment of this. This is not a prophecy and then obviously him filling it in. I'm not saying that by any means. But what he does in kind of theory in Luke chapter 22, he then embodies in John chapter 13. So look back at Luke chapter 22. You'll kind of see the mindset behind this whole story. Luke chapter 22, starting in verse 24. It says, there arose a dispute among them as to which of them was regarded as the greatest. The deacons also have this conversation every Sunday and Wednesday. That's not true, by the way. I just wanted to take a shot. I can't build them up and then, or tear them down, I'll build them up. Flip that. There arose a dispute among them as to which one of them was regarded as the greatest. And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who have authority over them are called benefactors. But it is not this way with you, but the one who is the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant. And then see if verse 27 sounds familiar. Who is greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at the table, but I am among you as the one who serves? Jesus lays out this idea that's very obvious to everybody that knows anything about the way the social operations work. He says, look, when you look at a group of people, obviously the whole idea is to have authority over them. People are jockeying for position. People are looking for the greatest position they can possibly have over everybody else. They want power. They want authority. They want the paycheck that comes along with that. He says that's what the Gentiles do. You are not to be that way. And then as an embodiment of that, he says, look, I'm amongst you, not as one who is trying to be served, but as one who is serving. And what he says in Luke chapter 22, he fulfills in John chapter 13. He says, I'm among you as one who serves. And so the story in John chapter 13, at least in my opinion, fulfills kind of this idea of what it means to actually be a leader. And as great as this story is, oftentimes the best part of it is near the beginning. Look at John chapter 13, starting verse 1. Go back to this chapter now. John chapter 13, verse 1. We sometimes will just skip right over these first 3 or 4 verses, just kind of get to the meat of it. We want to see this section where Jesus is serving the apostles, where he's washing feet. That's obviously where the real lessons lie. And I make no arguments against it. I think that's obviously the main point of what's talked about here. But John gives some introductory material in this chapter that I think is worth noting. Look at John chapter 13, starting in verse 1. It says, now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, the devil having already put in the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come forth from God careful, you can look at John chapter 13, these first 3 or 4 verses, and you'll say, well, this is just kind of a nice little lead-in. You don't know who Jesus is? That's a little bit of what he's all about. I don't think that's why John brings this up. If you look at John chapter 13, those first 3 verses, what he does in this section is elevate the stakes of what it actually means to do what he has done. Starting with, in verse 1, if you're wondering at all what it means and how important the scene was in Jesus' mind, you talk about the question of love. How much did he love these people? He loved them to the end. This wasn't just something where he carried them along a little bit of the way. He did this and he did that. And he spoke to them nicely and he sacrificed for them. He loved them all the way to the end, past this point. So that shows the degree and the scale of what it means to actually love each other. Then you go into verse 2. How do you love even further than that? Well, how about washing the feet of your enemy? One who Jesus knew in the moment that was going to betray him later. And it's not as if this is just a thought that occurred to Judas during the middle of the supper. Hey, I think I'll go betray Jesus. This is something that the devil had already put into his heart. And Jesus knew that. And I would argue probably other people in the room had some kind of sneaking suspicion along it too. We know that he used to steal from the money box. John mentions that. And so as John reflects back on this moment, when he thinks about the scale of love, it's not just the duration of it, that he loved them to the end, but also the depth of it. The fact that he loved even Judas in this moment. And then he talks about the sheer authority and the power that Jesus had. The fact that not only in this moment is he the greatest teacher, the greatest miracle worker, the greatest, all the other things you can come about, but literally that he is God in the flesh. And John chapter 13, verse 3 mentions that he had put all things, that God the Father had put all things into his hand, and that Jesus has all authority that he could possibly have. Why bring all this up? Why is it that John brings this entire section up in John chapter 13, verses 1 through 3? Why talk about any of this is because to point out the fact that Jesus did not have to do this. If we get one thing, at least away from this early part of this lesson, understand the fact that Jesus did not have to do what he's about to do. He didn't have to demonstrate leadership. He could have demonstrated leadership by walking in the room and saying, all right, guys, I am the greatest among you. You want to know who the greatest is? Luke chapter 22? It's me. I'm the greatest. I'm just going to tell you that right now. And as to amplify this fact that I am the greatest, I am now going to command you to serve one another. And yet he doesn't do that. The idea of this is that he is the absolute greatest person alive, and to demonstrate his greatness and his power and his authority, he is going to then serve these people. Jesus didn't have to do any of this. But he does because he understands that submission is way better than just coercing people into that. Well, why do we say that? Because coercion creates compliance, but it doesn't create devotion. If Jesus had walked in and said all these different things about all the things that they needed to do, that would have gone over to a certain extent. He would have told them what they needed to do. They would have followed it. They would have gone off into the wilderness and they would have followed it to a certain extent. But that doesn't stick with you. And it really is, if we're being honest with ourselves, only kind of surface deep. But if you really truly want to create disciples, people who will follow you to the ends of the earth, and this isn't a recipe for anybody that wants to create a cult. That's not what I'm getting at. But if you really want to create disciples, you have to generate devotion. And I mentioned earlier that this is the engine that drives the entire rest of this narrative, and I mean it. Look in John chapter 14, starting verse 18. Jesus is going to kind of recycle back around the same idea, and he does it several times. But this is just one of them. John chapter 14, starting verse 18, this is what he says here. He says, I will not leave you with orphans. Come to me. I will, for a little while the world will no longer see me, but you will see me because I live, there you live also. In that day you will know that I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you. He who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me. And he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him, and I will disclose myself to him. Judas, not Iscariot, let's just get that straight. It's not that guy. Judas then said to him, Lord, what then has happened that you are going to disclose yourself to us and not to the world? And Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him. He who does not love me does not keep my words, and the word which you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me. We talked a little bit about the whole idea of love and obedience, all those types of things in Bible class. But Jesus punctuates it with things like this. And it seems odd in our day and age, especially with the culture we live in, to correlate the idea of obedience and servitude and doing things that are commanded of you with love. Because love is so oftentimes seen as just an emotional feeling. And you'll see all over the place people either outside these four walls or sometimes even really matter if I do the other things, because after all, I still care about him. It's not the way Jesus phrased it. Jesus said in John chapter 14, verse 18 through 24, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Those two ideas don't work unless you want to keep the commandments. Unless I can see a reason for me to follow through and actually do what you're asking me to do. And not just what you've asked me to do, but even beyond what you've asked me to do. I'm not just going to talk about you to a few people. I'm going to talk about Jesus to lots of people. I'm not just going to sacrifice a little bit for God. I'm going to sacrifice everything for God. And what Jesus has asked of us to do is not just simple compliance, not just going through the motions, not just doing the things, but actual devotion to him. You can train anybody to come in these four walls on a Sunday and a Wednesday, sing songs, amen at prayers, follow along in the Bible, and just kind of close it up and leave. Anybody can do that. But devotion occurs not only in our intensity of what we're doing here, whether or not this actually means anything to me, and whether or not I carry it elsewhere. In 1 John chapter 4, starting in verse 15, this is a lesson that John would carry with him for quite some time. 1 John chapter 4, starting in verse 15. 1 John chapter 4, starting in verse 15. He says, whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God abides in him and he in God. We have come to know and have believed the love which God has for us. God is love. He is the embodiment of love. And the one who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. By this, love is perfected within us, so that we may have confidence in the day of judgment, because as he is, so also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment. The one who fears is not perfected in love. We love, verse 19, because he first loved us. If you're wondering what the genesis of the devotion that the apostles had towards Jesus, this is it. And not only was it, as we would describe in today's world, the idea that Jesus sacrificed his life for us, which is by itself enough. But they also witnessed Jesus on a number of different occasions give of his own time and his own resources to help people. We saw him heal people when he was beyond tired. They saw him stop and talk to a Syrophoenician woman who was ostracized by every single person in the entire universe at that point in time. And they also saw him in John chapter 13 get on his knees in front of them and serve them by washing their feet hours before he was to commit the ultimate sacrifice by giving his life. Something like that sticks with you as a person. If you've ever had a boss, if you've ever had somebody in your life that seems to be a service-oriented individual, service-first-oriented individual, your devotion towards that person is always going to be more intense than somebody who just bosses your way. Because you care deeply not only about them, you care deeply about the mission, but most importantly because you feel like they care about you. There's a story about George Washington, and it's probably apocryphal in nature. But there's a story about George Washington where at the end of the Revolutionary War, this was 1780 to 81, a lot of his captains and his officers had not received pay for the years that they had served. And as anybody would in that sense, they were understandably very angry about that. And so they approached George Washington and they told him, look, we haven't been paid, and if we don't get paid, we're going to leave our post and we're just going to go find work. We've got to feed our families, all those different things. And Washington understood it at the time for what it is. It's a very reasonable request. And so what Washington did was he said, all right, I'm going to write a letter and I'm going to help you get this stuff sorted out so that you can go get paid in the way that you should. And so in front of everybody, he got up and he immediately caught his back. And then he grabbed the table and then he reached for his glasses. And as people are looking at him, there are people that have been with him for a few years at this point. He grabs his glasses and he shakes as he puts them on his eyes. And he says, according to legend, you'll have to excuse me, gentlemen, for I've given up a lot in the service of my country, including my own eyesight. And those officers saw that moment take place in front of them. It wasn't anymore about them getting paid. It was about the higher calling of what it actually means to serve, actually do a duty that goes beyond just simple obligation. In 1 John chapter 4, verses 15 through 19, it touches on essentially the same thing in verse 19 when he says, we love because he first loved us. The reason that I'm obedient is not just because God told me to be obedient. The reason I'm obedient is because I saw his love for me, and I want to generate that love back. And I think this is the text. If you look back at verse 18, it says, there's no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love. There are some people who are Christians, maybe inside this room, maybe outside this room. There are some people who are Christians in today's world simply because they don't want to go to hell. And if chose to illustrate what it meant to actually serve by getting on his knees and washing people's feet. You may listen to this entire sermon, you may think to yourself, well, this is a sermon on leadership. It doesn't really matter a whole lot in the day-to-day world. After all, Jesus is our head. We're going to do it regardless of our motivation. And to that, you would be right. If we just did that this entire sermon and all it was a discussion on Jesus' love for us and how we need to obey him, it'd be a great sermon. Nothing wrong with that. That's not where this idea ends. Look in Ephesians, the 6th chapter. When you carry this same thought process out into other aspects of our life, what we find out is that this idea of servant leadership, this idea of actually serving other people and submitting to them instead of coercing them, has ramifications in a whole lot of other places. Ephesians chapter 5, starting in verse 22. Everybody's favorite marriage. He says, wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. As the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. Verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ also with the church gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. Verse 28. Husbands also ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church. We talk about the nature of marriage in today's world. People oftentimes subconsciously will think to themselves, how can this marriage be better for me? It would absolutely nobody in the entire world wants to hear, because it would be the world's shortest self-help book ever known to man, is that the key to a happy marriage is not by dominating the other person and forcing them to serve you, but in serving other people. And what he says there, especially in Ephesians 5, verses 22 and 23, may be the more difficult one for the wives, because you're dealing with women who oftentimes are not married to believers. Sometimes these people have dominating husbands, dominating husbands, who don't listen to them, who don't take into account what they want. And yet he still even says in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, that you need to submit to them. And then he hits on the men. And he says, man, you need to have this same mindset in yourself. Not in the sense of lording it over them, like he was talking about with the eldership in 1 Peter chapter 5. But you need to submit to them. You need to think about your wives, not in the sense of being lower than you are, but in being higher than you are. And the demonstration that he gives for that is in the same way that Christ also loved the church. Jesus didn't just boss the church around. His first mode was to sacrifice for him. And if Jesus was willing to do that for the church, then why wouldn't we do it for other people, for our wife? Nevertheless, verse 33, each individual among you is also to love his own wife even as himself, and the wife must see to it that she also respects her husband. You want to get one little verse that speaks to a happy marriage? Verse 33 is this. You have to submit to each other. To think about what's best for the other person before you think about what's best for yourself. And oftentimes what we'll find out is that those interests are more aligned than we sometimes think. What about regards to our family? Ephesians chapter 6, starting verse 1, he says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. I had this verse beaten into me as a child, specifically the last part, for this is right. Verse 2, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with the promise, so that it may be well with you, and that you may live long in the earth. The whole point of verses 2 and 3 goes back to the Old Testament, where respect for authority from your parents bleeds over into respect for God. But the whole idea of all three verses, when he says respect your parents or honor your parents in the Lord, for this is right, is encapsulated in that phrase, in the Lord. And the idea is not necessarily always in spiritual things. That's not really what he gets at. It always has to do with spiritual things. He says, serve them as you would serve the Lord. That's where the whole context comes. If we respect our parents, we will obviously respect God as well. And the breakdown of that unit can obviously be described as probably breaking down the entire ancient nation of Israel. In verse 4, however, this is the verse that I've always gravitated towards in the last 10 or so years. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. I've thought about that verse a lot in recent years, primarily because I have become a father myself. But you also think about that in terms of what it means to actually have your children respect and love and obey. And I don't have all the answers for that, in case you think that me having a 10, 9, and a 6-year-old gives me all the life experience that you offer. But I do think the point of this verse is rock solid. Because sometimes as parents, we oftentimes want to say the phrase, well, you should do this because I told you so, or you should do so, but to actually love us and do what's best for us, then we have to teach them why. And I love what he says in verse 4 in the second half of that when he says, bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord, almost as if to say that if you do that, you will not rear them up. Submitting to our family, submitting to each other is the only way for us to have a family unit. You knew where this last one was going. You can even do this in the workplace. I operate in a workplace where we submit to each other, so this is a non-issue with me. But I have seen it in other churches where it's not, where it isn't. You've got elderships that are coordinating or kind of threatening over the preacher and threatening over the congregation. You've got a congregation that's on the verge of mutiny, which is not a good situation. But in the workplace, you have the same idea of submission. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 5, he says, slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in the sincerity of your heart, as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men please, which you could do. You could do the bare minimum if you wanted to. But as slaves of Christ, whom you will have gone from the heart, with goodwill render service, as to the Lord, not to men, and knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. It's not easy to tell a slave you need to follow your master. It's not easy to tell your slave, you need to follow your master, even if he's harsh. And it's the hardest thing in the world to tell a slave, go above and beyond for a harsh master. But the argument he makes here in verses 5 down to verse 8 is saying to him, serve and do your duty as if you're doing it to God. That generates something just an inch deeper. Verse 9, masters do the same things to them, give up threatening, knowing that your master of yours is heaven, and there's no partiality with it. It's easy for a boss, not that I would know, but it's easier for a boss or it's easier for a master to look at somebody underneath him and say the exact same